Welcome to our deep dive into Timothy Snyder's On Tyranny. You've sent us some excerpts, and it seems like you're looking for insights on how history can help us understand the challenges to democracy today.
Yeah, absolutely. And Snyder's book is it's really relevant, in our current moment. It's a bit of a wake-up call, I think, for a lot of people.
I mean, it really is. And one of the first things that kind of jumped out at me was this idea of anticipatory obedience,
Oh, yeah.
which is, well, kind of unsettling when you think about it.
Yeah.
It's like people are already adapting to a repressive government's wishes even before they're explicitly told to.
Right, like they're trying to anticipate what the new rules are going to be, even if those rules are still unspoken or in flux. And it can be a survival mechanism, but it also makes it easier for a repressive regime to gain a foothold, right?
Totally. Like, if people are already self-censoring and conforming, even without direct orders, it's like giving permission.
Right, exactly. And Snyder uses this example of Austria in 1938, just before the Nazi annexation, where a lot of Austrians, even those who weren't initially like on board with the Nazi ideology, started participating in the persecution of Jews.
Oh, wow.
So it's like they were sending a message, even as unconsciously, about what they were willing to tolerate.
And the Nazis were paying attention.
Exactly. It showed them the boundaries of what was possible. And it's chilling, isn't it, that ordinary people can be complicit in the erosion of their own freedoms.
Totally.
Just by trying to, adapt.
It reminds me of that Milgram experiment, the one at Yale, where...
Oh, yeah, the shock experiment.
Yeah, the participants thought they were delivering electric shocks to another person. And I remember learning about that, I don't know, in high school or something, and just being like, no way, I would never do that. But
right, you'd think you'd resist, right.
Totally.
But then you see how many people went along with it just because a guy in a lab coat told them to.
It's scary. And the fact that it wasn't just like people with authoritarian personalities or whatever, it was like anyone.
Right, anyone can be swayed under the right circumstances, and that's Snyder's point, right? We all need to be aware of this tendency in ourselves.
Yeah.
It's not about judging others, it's about recognizing our own potential for conformity, especially in situations where fear and uncertainty are high.
Oh, yeah.
Which describes our world pretty well right now.
So we've got this individual level of anticipatory obedience, but Snyder also says that institutions aren't immune to this kind of erosion either.
Right. He used the example of German Jews after Hitler came to power in 1933. Many of them actually believed that the existing democratic structures, like the courts, the Constitution, would ultimately protect them.
Yeah, they thought, okay, he might be in charge, but surely he won't actually dismantle the whole system.
Yeah, but they underestimated Hitler's willingness to do just that. And Snyder quotes an editorial from a Jewish newspaper from that time where they were expressing this hope that Hitler would act as a European power.
Oh, wow. And by that they meant, respecting the rule of law and those kinds of things.
That's heartbreaking, to have that much faith in a system that's already kind of
crumbling around them.
Yeah. I mean, it really highlights the danger of complacency, doesn't it? Just assuming that these institutions that are supposed to protect us will always be there.
It's like that saying, eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. We can't just sit back and expect things to work out on their own.
And then he brings up this term Gleichschaltung, which he describes as the Nazis' method of co-opting institutions, turning them from protectors of democracy into tools of the regime.
Right, like a virus infiltrating a healthy cell. So they might take over a respected institution, maybe a school or a newspaper, even a church, and then slowly start to twist its purpose.
Oh, wow.
To fit their agenda.
So from the outside, it still looks like the same institution, but on the inside, it's been completely hollowed out.
Exactly. And because it happens gradually, it can be hard to recognize until it's too late.
Yeah.
That's the scary part. So what does that mean for us today? Like, are there institutions in our own lives that we're taking for granted? And what happens if we stop engaging with them?
That's the question, isn't it? Like, what do we value? And what are we doing to protect those things? We can't just assume they'll always be there.
Snyder's third lesson really zeroes in on that potential for a gradual slide into authoritarianism.
Yeah.
And that is the dangers of a one-party state. He points out that democracies throughout history have collapsed when one party gains total control.
And it's like that old saying, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. When there's no check on their ambitions, no one to hold them accountable, things can go bad quickly.
And he says it rarely happens overnight. It's often this slow, insidious process. He even talks about these salami tactics, where the ruling party slices away at the opposition bit by bit.
Right, like you're slicing a salami. Each slice might seem insignificant, but eventually the whole thing disappears. And that's how these regimes operate. They eliminate their rivals in stages until there's no one left to challenge them.
It's almost like a magic trick, you know? You're so focused on one hand that you don't notice what the other one is doing.
Exactly. And by the time people realize what's happened, it can be too late to reverse course.
So is Snyder saying that the U.S. is on the verge of becoming a one-party state?
Well, he's not making any predictions, but he is raising some important questions about potential parallels to recent elections. And I think it's a call to be vigilant, to pay attention to the warning signs of democratic erosion, and to be proactive about protecting our own system.
Okay, so we need to be aware of those warning signs. But what can we actually do to prevent this kind of slide towards authoritarianism?
Well, one of the things Snyder emphasizes is the importance of free and fair elections. He urges listeners to take concrete steps to strengthen those processes, like combating gerrymandering, advocating for paper ballots, ensuring transparent vote counting. All of those things are crucial.
I mean, it's a reminder that our right to vote is precious, but not something we can just take for granted.
Absolutely. And it's something we need to actively defend. Because, as Snyder says, any election could be the last truly free one you participate in.
It's pretty wild to think that any election could be the last free one.
Right.
But Snyder goes beyond just elections, you know, those big picture things.
Right.
He also talks about how our everyday actions and choices matter, too.
He says life is political.
Yeah.
Which I think is easy to forget, you know, in our daily lives. But it's true. Every choice we make, every word we say contributes to the political landscape in some way.
It's like we're all part of this big, messy tapestry.
Yeah.
And Snyder uses some pretty intense examples to illustrate that.
Right.
Like those Soviet propaganda posters that depicted prosperous farmers as pigs.
Yeah.
It was a way to dehumanize them before the whole collectivization thing.
Totally. And let's not forget the marking of Jewish shops in Nazi Germany.
Oh, yeah.
It seems like a small thing, but it was deliberate. It was a way to turn envy into a weapon.
And it really set the stage for even greater atrocities.
Yeah. It's chilling to think about how those seemingly small actions can have such huge consequences.
That makes you think twice about those unintended messages we might be sending.
For sure. But Snyder also highlights the power of those small acts of resistance, like, you know, refusing to wear a swastika pin, not repeating some meaningless political slogan, challenging hateful rhetoric in everyday conversations.
Yeah.
Those things might seem insignificant, but they chip away at the facade.
It's like that Vaclav Havel idea, living in truth.
Exactly. By choosing authenticity, even in small ways, we can disrupt the narrative. And sometimes those small acts can inspire others.
Yeah, it's like a ripple effect.
Right.
So it's not just about avoiding harmful actions. It's about actively trying to create a more just and democratic society.
Absolutely.
It makes you wonder, what symbols and messages are we encountering in our daily lives, and what kind of impact are they having?
That's a good question to think about. Then, you know, Snyder shifts gears a bit and talks about the role of professionals.
Yeah.
Especially when a society is teetering on the edge of tyranny.
Right. He says that when political leaders set a bad example, it's really up to people in positions of authority, you know, professionals, to uphold ethical standards. And he talks about how the Nazi regime relied on all these professionals, lawyers, judges, doctors, businessmen, all these respected people.
Yeah, and imagine the pressure those individuals must have felt to conform.
Oh, totally.
To go against the grain, to refuse to participate, could have meant losing everything.
Yeah.
Their careers, their reputations, even their lives.
He gives some really chilling examples like, you know, lawyers twisting the law to justify racial discrimination, doctors conducting horrific medical experiments, businessmen profiting from slave labor. It's
hard to fathom.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder, like, what would I do in that situation? Would I have the courage to stand up for what's right?
Right. And that's a question we all need to ask ourselves because, as Snyder points out, when those in power are corrupt, it's really up to individuals with integrity to push back.
Okay. And speaking of danger signs, Snyder has this whole section on paramilitaries.
Oh, yeah.
He sees them as a real red flag, like an early indicator that a democracy's in trouble.
And he's not just talking about your average police force or National Guard.
Right.
He's talking about groups that operate outside the bounds of legitimate law enforcement, often with the approval of those in power, even if it's just tacit approval.
He uses examples like the Iron Guard in Romania, the Arrow Cross in Hungary, and of course the SA and SS in Nazi Germany.
Right.
And these groups, they create a climate of fear. They intimidate opponents, and they ultimately help pave the way for authoritarian rule.
And what's scary is that they often start out with this veneer of respectability.
Oh, yeah.
You know, they present themselves as defenders of law and order or as patriots.
Right.
But their real purpose is to silence dissent.
And to consolidate power.
Exactly. And Snyder even connects this to the current political climate in the U.S.,
Oh, yeah?
expressing concern about the blurring of lines between legitimate law enforcement and private security forces.
It's a reminder to be vigilant, to pay attention to what political leaders are saying and doing, and also what their supporters are saying and doing. Are they condoning violence? Are they undermining the rule of law?
Those are important questions.
Yeah.
Because history shows that these groups can go from fringe groups to powerful tools of repression pretty quickly.
And once that happens, it's really hard to reverse course.
Yeah, it can be really hard to put that genie back in the bottle. Then Snyder raises this question that I think is really important. What happens when our sense of duty clashes with our conscience? You know, he argues that individuals in positions of authority, especially those who carry weapons, need to be prepared to say no when they're ordered to do something unethical or illegal.
He uses some really powerful historical examples to illustrate that, like the role of the regular police in the Soviet Great Terror, providing manpower for mass executions.
Yeah, and the German police who participated in the Holocaust, you know, carrying out mass shootings alongside the SS, these were people who were just following orders.
Right.
But at what point does following orders become complicity? At what point does our responsibility to our fellow human beings outweigh our obedience to authority?
That's a tough question.
It is. It's a really tough question, but it's one we need to grapple with, I think, before we're faced with it in a real-life situation. Because when the pressure's on, it can be incredibly difficult to do the right thing.
It takes courage to disobey an order, especially when it's coming from someone in a position of power.
For sure. And as Snyder reminds us, sometimes the most courageous act is to simply say no. And speaking of courage, that brings us to one of my favorite lessons from the book, the courage to stand out.
Yeah, he reminds us that it takes real guts to resist conformity, especially when everyone else seems to be giving in.
Yeah. And he starts by telling this amazing story about Winston Churchill's defiance in 1940.
Oh, yeah, when everyone was telling him to just give in.
Right, most of Europe had fallen to the Nazis. Britain was facing the threat of invasion. Even many of Churchill's own people were urging him to make peace with Hitler. Imagine the pressure.
Oh, it's unimaginable.
But Churchill refused to back down. He believed that resisting tyranny was worth fighting for, even if it meant standing alone.
Yeah. And ultimately, his courage helped turn the tide of the war. It's a powerful reminder that one person's courage can make a huge difference.
Absolutely. But Snyder doesn't just focus on those larger-than-life figures like Churchill.
Right.
He also shares this more personal story from the book. The story of Teresa Prekarowa, a young woman who risked her life to help Jewish families escape the Warsaw Ghetto during the Nazi occupation.
That's an incredible story.
It is. It's a story about quiet courage, the kind of bravery that doesn't seek recognition.
Yeah.
Prekarowa didn't see herself as a hero. She felt like she was just doing what any decent person would do.
Right.
But her actions were extraordinary. She stood out. She refused to be a bystander.
Yeah. It's a powerful reminder that we all have that potential for heroism within us.
Absolutely. And it doesn't have to involve those grand gestures.
Right.
It can be about making those small choices, even when they're difficult, even when they're scary.
Like in the Warsaw Ghetto example. Then Snyder dives into the importance of language.
Oh, yeah. He says we need to be kind to our language.
Be kind to our language.
Yeah. What do you think he means by that?
I'm not sure.
Well, he's talking about how totalitarian regimes manipulate language, you know, to control thought. He cites Victor Klemperer, this scholar who studied the language of the Third Reich. And Klemperer noticed how the Nazis used simple slogans and repeated phrases to basically shut down critical thinking.
Oh, interesting. Like they were trying to create a kind of linguistic fog where complex ideas couldn't penetrate.
Exactly. And Snyder sees some parallels to that in our own time, especially with how political discourse is shaped by the 24/7 news cycle and social media.
It's all about sound bites and sensationalism.
Right.
There's not a lot of room for nuance.
Not much room for deep thought. And I think we get so bombarded with information that it can be really hard to even know what's true anymore.
Yeah.
You know, what's important.
It's like we're drowning in information, but thirsty for knowledge.
Exactly. And that's why Snyder urges us to be more mindful of the language we use and consume.
Hmm.
Read books, have those thoughtful conversations, resist the urge to just repeat the slogans and talking points we see on TV or online.
Yeah, it's about thinking for ourselves,
Yeah.
forming our own opinions,
Yeah.
not just reacting to whatever's in front of us.
Exactly.
Step away from the screens, folks. Pick up a book. Then Snyder gets into this idea of truth.
Oh, yeah. Lesson 10, believe in truth.
Right.
He argues that if we abandon facts, we're essentially abandoning freedom.
That's a powerful statement.
And I think he's right. Because if nothing is true, then no one can challenge those in power.
Right.
There's no basis for criticism or dissent.
And he identifies these 4 ways in which truth can be eroded. Outright lies, shamanistic incantation, magical thinking, and misplaced faith.
Yeah. It's a pretty comprehensive list, unfortunately.
So outright lies. I mean, we're all familiar with those.
Right. The deliberate spreading of falsehoods.
Yeah.
And with social media, it's easier than ever for them to go viral.
And then there's that shamanistic incantation thing. Snyder says this is all about endless repetition.
Yeah, you just keep hammering away at the message, whether it's true or not. And eventually people start to believe it.
It's like brainwashing.
Right. And then there's magical thinking.
Which is?
Embracing contradiction, believing things that are demonstrably false simply because they feel good or fit into your worldview.
Like believing in fairy tales, even when we know better.
Exactly. And then finally, there's misplaced faith.
Mm-hmm.
This is where people put their trust in a leader or an ideology, even when it's been proven to be harmful.
Like blind faith in a cult leader.
Exactly. And Snyder argues that all 4 of these were present in Nazi Germany.
Oh, wow.
And he sees echoes of them in our own time, which is
right.
pretty disturbing.
It is. So what's the antidote to all of this?
Well, Snyder says we have to actively seek out the truth.
Okay.
Be critical consumers of information, question what we read and hear, be willing to challenge our own beliefs.
So it's a constant process.
It is. It's a fight.
Yeah.
But it's a fight worth having.
And then he gets into this idea of investigating.
Oh, yeah. Like being your own detective,
Right.
which is really important in the age of the internet.
Yeah. We can't just passively consume whatever pops up in our feeds.
Right. We have to be more proactive.
So how do we do that?
Well, Snyder encourages us to spend more time with long-form articles, support investigative journalism,
Okay.
and be aware that some of what's on the internet is actually designed to harm us.
Like be aware of those bad actors.
Exactly. Be aware of those bad actors. And he also reminds us that we have a responsibility for what we communicate to others.
Yeah.
We shouldn't be spreading fake news or unverified information.
It's like that old game of telephone where the message gets all distorted as it goes from person to person.
Right. So think before you share. Do your research. Be critical of what you read. And only share information that you know to be accurate.
Lesson 12 is a little more, a little lighter, I guess.
Yeah. Make eye contact and small talk.
Okay.
It sounds simple, right?
Yeah.
But Snyder argues that those small acts of connection are really important,
Yeah.
especially in times of tyranny, because they help combat that sense of isolation and atomization.
And when we connect with others, we build relationships, we create community,
Yeah,
and it makes it harder for those in power to divide us.
exactly. And Snyder points out that, in times of fear and repression, those small acts of kindness can really mean the world to people who are feeling vulnerable.
It's a good reminder that we need to look out for each other.
Absolutely. So
Yeah.
make an effort to connect, even if it's just a smile or a friendly greeting.
Yeah.
You never know how much it might mean to someone.
Okay. Lesson 13, practice corporeal politics.
Get off the couch.
Right.
Put down your phone and get involved.
Okay. So this is about taking action.
It is. Because real change doesn't happen online. It happens when people come together in the real world to demand change.
Like protests.
Yeah, like the Solidarity movement in Poland. They challenged communist rule through strikes, demonstrations, grassroots organizing.
Right.
It's a powerful example of how ordinary people can make a difference when they work together.
So find a cause you believe in. Join an organization. Get involved.
Right. And as Snyder reminds us, if tyrants feel no consequences for their actions in the three-dimensional world, nothing will change.
Okay.
Powerful stuff.
Lesson 14, establish a private life.
Protect your data.
Yeah.
Because authoritarians often use information about their citizens to control them.
We saw that in the 2016 election, right?
Exactly. And it's a reminder that in the digital age, privacy is more important than ever.
Right.
So Snyder urges us to be mindful of our digital footprint. Protect our personal information. Be wary of online platforms that are collecting and exploiting our data.
Yeah. And he also encourages us to have more face-to-face conversations.
Yeah. Build those relationships offline.
Right. Create those spaces where we can connect without fear of surveillance.
Absolutely. It's about reclaiming our right to privacy.
Okay. Contribute to good causes.
Yeah. Put your money where your mouth is.
Support organizations and charities that you believe in.
Right.
So this is about, putting your values into action.
It is. And it doesn't have to be a huge financial contribution.
Right.
Even small donations can make a difference.
And Snyder points out that, authoritarian regimes are often hostile to those independent organizations and charities.
Yeah. They see them as a threat.
So by supporting them, we're not just doing good, we're defending freedom.
Exactly.
Okay. Learn from peers in other countries.
Yeah. Build relationships with people from different parts of the world.
Okay.
Learn from their experiences. Share strategies for resisting tyranny.
Because as he points out, a lot of the challenges we're facing here in the U.S., other people have already faced them.
Yeah, there's nothing new under the sun, right? And we can learn a lot from each other.
He specifically mentions the experience of Ukraine, which has been dealing with Russian disinformation campaigns for years now.
Right.
And he points out that Ukrainian journalists and activists have actually developed some pretty effective strategies for countering propaganda. So let's reach out to our friends and colleagues in other countries, share our stories, and learn from each other's experiences.
We're stronger together.
Well, Stryker. Lesson 17. Listen for dangerous words.
Oh, yeah. Be alert to how language is being used to manipulate and control us.
Words can be weapons.
They can. And Snyder specifically mentions the words extremism and terrorism.
Which are often used to demonize anyone who disagrees.
Exactly. And they're often used to justify the suppression of dissent.
Yeah, and the curtailment of civil liberties.
Even violence.
So we need to be really critical of the way language is being used.
Absolutely. Don't just accept labels or categories at face value. Ask questions. Challenge assumptions. Demand evidence.
It's about being vigilant.
It is.
Okay.
Yeah.
Be calm when the unthinkable arrives.
Oh, yeah. This is a tough one.
Yeah.
But it's so important.
Snyder reminds us that authoritarians love to exploit those moments of crisis. We saw this in Nazi Germany after the Reichstag fire.
Right. Hitler used that as an excuse to suspend civil liberties and establish a dictatorship.
So if there's a terrorist attack or some other kind of major crisis, we need to be extra careful.
Yeah. Don't give in to fear or panic.
Right.
Remember, due process, the rule of law, all those things, even in times of emergency.
Okay, and that leads us to Snyder's definition of patriotism.
Yeah, it's not about blind loyalty or anything like that. It's
Right.
about being active, being informed, holding your country to a higher standard.
Yeah, and he draws this really sharp distinction between patriotism and nationalism.
Oh, yeah.
Nationalism, he says, is about exclusion. It's about drawing lines between us and them.
Right. It thrives on fear and resentment.
Yeah, whereas patriotism, he says it's about love for your country, but it's a love that's clear-eyed. It's about recognizing the flaws and working to make things better.
Yeah, it's about service. It's about recognizing that we're all in this together and we have a responsibility to make things more just and equitable.
Okay, so how do we put this kind of patriotism into practice? It feels like such a huge concept.
Yeah, it can feel overwhelming. But Snyder suggests starting small. Be an informed citizen. Participate in your community. Support organizations that are working to make a difference. Speak out against injustice. And most importantly, vote.
So it's about those everyday actions again, recognizing that we all have a role to play.
Absolutely.
And that brings us to Snyder's final lesson, and maybe the most challenging one of all.
Yeah,
Be as courageous as you can.
that's a tall order.
I know. Feels a little overwhelming after everything we've been talking about.
I hear you. But I think Snyder's point is that we don't all have to be like superheroes or martyrs.
Right.
It's about finding courage in those everyday moments, in the choices that we make.
He reminds us that throughout history, ordinary people have shown incredible bravery in resisting tyranny. I mean, think of the people who hid Jews during the Holocaust, or those who stood up to totalitarian regimes in Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
They weren't superhuman, They were just ordinary people who decided to do the right thing.
And that's what Snyder is asking of us, to find that courage within ourselves.
Yeah.
To speak truth to power, to defend the vulnerable, to resist conformity, to stand up for what we believe in.
He has this line that really stuck with me. If none of us is prepared to die for freedom, then all of us will die under tyranny.
Yeah. It's a powerful statement. It's a reminder that freedom isn't free. It's something we have to fight for.
But I think he also makes it clear that courage doesn't always have to be about those big dramatic actions.
Right.
Sometimes it's about those quiet acts of defiance, like refusing to repeat a harmful stereotype, or speaking up when you see someone being bullied.
Yeah, those everyday acts of courage.
Yeah. It's about recognizing that each act of courage, no matter how small, can make a difference.
It can create a ripple effect.
So, listener's name, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have.
Snyder's on Tyranny is packed with insights, and it's definitely given us a lot to think about. What struck you as the most powerful lesson? And what will you do differently, starting today, to safeguard freedom?
As Snyder reminds us, history does not repeat, but it does instruct.
Yeah.
And by understanding the patterns of the past, we can hopefully build a better future.